Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am going to be touching on a topic that will piss off a lot of people. Um, in fact, this is going to be about three different topics rolling into one. And it comes down to the belief structures of today versus what actually is or was and society's views, depending on the time and era stretching back over 2,006 or 7,000 years worth of duality. So, as I said, this is going to piss off a lot of people. Hello, Lilith. Welcome to the party. So, like I said, this is going to piss off a lot of a lot of people in a lot of different groups, not only on the Hebraic systems, but also what is classified as the quote and unquote left hand path belief systems. And it's going to burst a lot of bubbles. Now, I'm going to try to hurry through this because I got to head out in about 30 minutes or so. And if not, try to get, probably about 40 minutes max. But I wanted to do this video real fast and get it out there and just say, hey, this is what is and what is not. And I wanted to give you some references as well while I do this. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about today's world. Okay. The belief system in correlation with what is considered as the damned or the dying or the dead. Modern belief structures of necromancy or necromantic rituals, which is also associated with shamanism, black magic, witchcraft, sorceries. Okay. These things are very well known throughout the ages in one form or another. Now, I've done posts describing the three different spellings of necromancy. Today's version is based off the Greek, meaning the art of the dead or death magic, the practice thereof. Where in the past time, about 500 years ago, it was known as nigromancy, as in Nigr, nigromancy, which means black or dark arts. This version of necromancy is associated with blood, such as menstrual blood, sperm, sex magic, the cutting of your own flesh, what is believed to be associated with corpses. Now, the fear of corpses and the laws of the land today, especially in the East, and where, how should I say this? The belief structure of that it is illegal for someone to defile a corpse, such as to cut off a limb, sever a head, take a femur or two of a recently departed individual. The hand of glory type thing. Okay. Even human sacrificing, which is done mostly nowadays over in Malawi region of Africa. Some tribes in South America that practice Quimbanda and Umbanda, these two different religions, which derive from the Yoruba people out of Africa, the first settlers along the Nile. When they believed, they're considered basically the most bloodiest and most brutal religions out there. Second to this is Palo Mayombe. But there's other versions of this as well, going back into the shamanism and witchcraft and Satanism and demonolatry and all these different practices. But 1,000 years ago, nigromancy was spelled with a Y, as in NY, G-R. Okay? Ne- necromancy. Necromancy. Nigromancy. And then instead of the Y, it is now today with an E. Okay? Necro, meaning corpse or death. Okay? This is actually associated a lot with the Kabbalah, the Klapoth, or the tree of life within the Bible. And it's associated with this because of the fact that it's now associated about 500 years ago, was associated with demonolatry or angelology. The belief structure in a being that you had to call on so that they would be able to do this right or to bless the right of necromancy. You consider in the Constitution of Pope Honorius, otherwise known as the Grimoire of Honorius, the right was that the practitioner or would-be necromancer would go to a cemetery and dig up a corpse in the middle of winter with his bare hands. Dig up the corpse, defile it. Take the femurs, go into a church, lay on the church and speak in Latin or cuneiform. You now report to me, basically. And then they would have to go and walk over 1,400 steps. That's a very long walk, especially if you just dug up a fresh corpse with your hands. Okay? Now, what's interesting about this is that then you would go back to what is now known as the Black Mass and perform the rite to be given the right of being called a necromancer and being associated with the dead. Pope Honorius was one of the more Christianized versions of grimoire writers. The Goetia of Solomon, the king, was also a Christian writer. And this is something that is also very unique because even in what is known as the Grand Grimoire, the Grand Grimoire Red Dragon, two different tomes between the 17th century and the 18th century, had a much wider contrast when it came to necromancy or the art of necromancy, the black arts. And what's interesting about this view is they had a more watered down version. Basically, it was based off that of, say, for an example, Cornelius Agrippa. Okay, who dealt more, he looked at it more like putting smelly herbs down the throat of the deceased to try to forcefully bring them back, to conjure them. Whereas in Francis Barrett's The Magus was more of, the tome itself was based off Christian fear, the fear of the dead or fear of dying. Now, if we look at the terminology of a practitioner of necromancy, witchcraft, shamanism, medicine men, sorcerers, warlocks, mages, sages, these individuals are depicted of standing or living either just outside on the premises of a community, or they live way out in the woods. Okay? Now, what's interesting about just these little grimoires, The Magus by Francis Barrett, the three books of occult philosophy by Henry Cornelius Agrippa, the Constitution of Pope Honorius, the Grand Grimoire Red Dragon. Okay, now we can even go into a more Christianized versions, such as the Keys of Solomon versus, say, for an example, the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, where they're constantly praising the Almighty God, as in the Father of all, such as Ra, Odin, Zeus, the fathers of the gods, And what's interesting about this is that this fear of death or dying or being associated with the fears of anyone who's associated with death or does something with the dead, such as conjurations, or how should I say this? Bringing forth a spirit through conjuration is basically frowned upon. You're considered an outcast. You're considered to be part of the damned, because many of the belief systems dating back to many of the, like the, as you know, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, going to say, for an example, dealing with the gods themselves. You're already dead. You're part. You've given up your right to being resurrected. You've given up your right to be in the kingdom of God. And a lot of this can be traced throughout history, dating back the last 1,000 years, especially in the Dark Ages. Today, it is looked at as a game. It is looked at as something, an image. It is more like, say, for example, two men standing in a circle in a cemetery with a pale but half-assed uh, apparition in front of them and standing inside of a triangle. Okay, so it's associated now with mathematics or geometrical shapes. Okay, like the triangle of evocation. You get into, say, for example, 500 years ago, this would be done in a place or a location where death had a heavy commune, such as a graveyard, an area where there was a battlefield, mass murder, or say, for example, where somebody had just recently passed away. 1,000 years ago, it was more associated with devil worship, where any sound was attributed to the devil. The Goetic demons of Solomon the King, also known as the Goetia, these beings, you literally had to ask for permission to even conduct one of these platforms of operations, such as dealing with the church. When we look at the church, such as the Vatican, the Roman Catholics, and then we look at the mystics, all those accused of witchcraft within the burning times in the witch trials, those who were hung, burned, drowned, or just simply beheaded, imprisoned for life, who would not confess, especially when words are being put down your throat? Those who were tortured, having their limbs separated from their bodies on the rack. Okay? Who would not simply take and tell these motherfuckers what they wanted to hear? When we look at things like Demonolatry by Nicholas Remy, an ancient historical account of witchcraft, or that of Discovery of Witchcraft by Reginald Scott, the witch's hammer, or the hammer of the witches, also known as How to Persecute and Seek Out a Witch, to get them to confess, was created by a Christian bishop. When we go back to the 2nd century, the Order of the Black Robe, we also see this. A member of an order of priests or monks who betrayed his oath to the priesthood was sentenced to death. And he made a deal to spare his life that he would create the largest book ever recorded in history. This book became known as the Codex Gigas, also known as the Devil's Bible. Okay. And it currently sits in the Polish Library Museum. And much of what I just discussed here can actually be seen throughout throughout European colosseums, such as the Polish Library Museum or the British Museum of Arts. Okay, you can actually see these remnants. You go to Salem, New Hampshire, and go to Stonehenge there, or you go over to England and you see Stonehenge there. You're going to see these rites where blood, death, and everything else was attributed to the myths and the legends of the sorcerer, the witch, the warlock, the shaman, the mage, the sage. Okay. And what's interesting about this is that you also notice how the languages change depending upon the, how should I say this? Based off the times and the era and how they viewed death, how they feared it. But if we follow this fear of death and this evilness of death and how it was perceived as being evil, and then associated with demons and angels and the jinn, you're seeing them associated with witchcraft and the arts and the practices. We can actually follow this all the way back to 7,000 years ago to ancient Sumeria, where there was a portion of individuals, such as morticians, okay, where people who was responsible for dealing with the dead, such as practitioners or those of the death dealers, those who basically were responsible for removing the dead from a location and burying the dead. Okay? These individuals were shunned. They were feared. They were basically looked down on and spat on because they were considered to be damned. They were considered to be part of the dead. They were considered to be evil because they gave up that right to be redeemed when they chose that field. But even in Sumeria, especially ancient Sumeria, these individuals had a place in society. Whereas today, Christians still think that they rule everything, that they have that right to tell you how to live your life. I told my son's mother just yesterday, she needs to give up that right. She needs to give up that notion that her mother is even going to have any reference of letting her run her own life. At 25, her mother is still running her life, telling her who to be with, what to do, where to move to, who should be in our son's life. The whole kit and caboodle. Just because you're a different religion. And what it comes down to, ladies and gentlemen, is the fact that you step on toes. Now, if we look back over the last 1,000 years at those who survived, it was those who literally did not step on the toes of the church. But if we also go back into history and historically speaking, along with mythological workings, we see that most of the tomes out there today, most of which I just spoke on, was written by some form of priesthood. Now, if you look at the times in the era which these crucial events took place, even King Solomon, an educated, wise man, went to the Witch of Endor and asked about a battle. Yeah, scratch that. It was actually Saul, who went under the cloak of night to a sorceress, a witch, known as the Witch of Endor, and asked, will this battle be victorious? and she summoned a soldier, a spirit, through blood sorcery. When we look at the times and the locations throughout history, most people did not even know how to read or write. So how could these individuals who were accused of witchcraft or being witches of lesser forms of life, lesser ranking people throughout society, be able to write a sacred tome such as a grimoire? When monks, when chapels, not chapels, but monasteries or the church were the only ones educated enough to even read and write. And if somebody, by any circumstance, by acquaintance, actually wrote a tome, it was confiscated and only kept in seclusion to the Christian Hebraic churches. Plain and simple. And even today, that same fear has spread into society, into other branches. When we look at pagan and Wiccan rites, they have a little thing called the threefold law of return. There is no mention of the threefold law of return before 1974, when Gerald Gardner created it. I had one individual literally argue with me that it predates Gerald Gardner and it can be found in an ancient scroll, ancient writings, an ancient book that was based in Arabic, that was written in Aramaic, ancient Aramaic. When I asked her for that proof, show me that working, she blocked and ran. So when we're talking about misbelief or misguided intentions, we see how it used to be done with herbs, whereas in the past, the family members were responsible for washing and cleaning up their dead relative. It was a matter of respect and honor. Today, you have to call 911. You have to have them come over, pronounce the individual DOA, dead on arrival, and then they take the corpse to a hospital as quickly as possible where the time of death is referenced. The paper is brought up and shipped off to a mortuary. Okay? To be buried as quickly as possible, cleaned up, so the family doesn't have to deal with it. So again, it comes down to the times, the era, the language, and the methods. Yet again. And yet people still go along with the herd conformity. So when we look at things like the threefold law of return, people don't like when you question them, when you step on their toes, when you get in their way of what they're trying to enforce within societal views of what is politically correct or what is legally correct to do and what you can and cannot do within a society. Okay? Now, what's also interesting here is that a few weeks ago, when I was in a little confrontation with VK Jahannam, Telia Curtis, Caitlin White, what's interesting to note here is that I'm personally gonna call out VK on this one because this actually applies to this conversation. Okay, a few years ago, I was talking with an individual, and I gave her the opportunity to step up into a higher role within a coven rite, the coven rites. And what's interesting about this is that she didn't feel she was ready for that, and I respected that. So what's ironic here is that here we are a few years later, and I stepped on VK Jahannam's little toes. His puny little toes. And he didn't like that much. So he did a video about me. And then he tried to say that I invited this woman to be a high priestess within the Black Mass. And he went on and said that, and I quote and unquote his own words, that a priestess's role is to give the priest a blowjob. Yeah, you're such a fucking dumbass. Because if you actually knew what a satanic rite was, you would not have said that stupid fucking comment. And I'll tell you why. Because in Satanism, the altar is a flesh altar. Basically meaning the volunteer, be it a priestess or a priest, depending on who's doing the rite, would volunteer to be, or even if it's a practitioner within that, who's participating within the rite itself, would lay naked on a table holding candles in both hands for all to view. Read the Satanic Bible by Anton Szandor LaVey, specifically the rites, and you'll have a better understanding, VK. Because this is what I'm talking about when you're sitting there leading people down the wrong path. When you're leading them to more watered down, amoral stupidity. To sit there and have any form of sexual relation during a ritual, it literally defeats the purpose of an actual energy raising. The point of a ritual, such as a Black Mass, which was created about 150 to 200 years ago in Europe by a nun, no less, literally talks about giving the devil his due. It's all about energy raising. It's about communion and calling upon these beings, these demons, these angels. Whatever happens after the ritual ends, that's between the individuals. Plain and simple. But it just goes to show you that people like VK, Telia Curtis, and Caitlin White is simply out there trying to make a name for themselves, leading you down the wrong path. Just like Christianity. They'll sit there and say, oh, the devil's trying to lead you. They're trying to destroy you. He's trying to destroy you. He will lead you down a path to death. What if I told you that there's actually a story about a Christian on Facebook being done by a fellow Christian who was in jail at the time, that literally met a man who was once a Christian, who was put in jail for criminal acts, and he prayed every fucking day to get out of that jail, because he was getting the shit beat out of him by the bailers, the people, the wardens and everything, because he had a history of saying that law enforcement is your enemy. They should be eliminated. So they basically beat the living shit out of him on a daily basis, multiple times a day. And he prayed to his God. He prayed to Jesus fucking Christ. He prayed to Jehovah. No help came. But then he got his hands on a magical tome. And that flip side of the coin occurred. And within a couple of weeks, he was in a different jail. Interesting how that works. A Christian becoming a Satanist. But let's take a look at the last 25 to 30 years. Since 1980, we have Christian witches. Christian witches. Now, according to Exodus chapter, I think it's 24, verse 18. Don't quote me on it. I believe it's chapter 24, verse 18, where it says, "Thou shalt not allow a witch to suffer." Basically meaning put to death. Now, what's interesting is even in the book of the law, which is the book of Leviticus, it talks about idol worship, just like it does in the Ten Commandments. God is the only God. There is no other God but him. To do so, or to create altars and forms of worship with lesser beings, you're basically condemning yourself. Again, you're seeing that fear, that misinformation, that misleading, misguiding notions that is watered down through all these texts, all these Christianized workings, depending on the era and the time that they were written. Even today, there's a Bible out there called the Christian Satanic Bible by Jeremy Adam Capps, which literally uses Christian doctrine for his communion with Satan. Interesting, isn't it? Now, here's the funny thing. Even though we're going back 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 2,500 years, 6,000 years, you're still seeing that duality, that conflict between light and dark, good and evil, day and night, life and death, that is basically ruled by Christianity in one form or another. But when we get into the languages, and this is something that I've been working with quite often lately, is dealing with linguistics. John Dee and Edward Kelly came across an ancient language, one of the forms of an ancient language known as the Celestial language. It is the angelic language known as Enochian. Okay, this language has popped up at least 3 times throughout history. 3 times. Uno, dos, tres. Then you have Theban, Anglo-Saxon, Indo-European, Germanic, and such, that date back about a couple thousand years. Today we have Latin. 500 years ago we had cuneiform. There's multiple different offsets of cuneiform there. But if we go back even further, we end up in different languages such as Aramaic. And there's different dialogues in that, especially that of the nomad Aramaic language, which E.A. Koetting literally came across in his own practices. That is an older, more ancient form or dialect of Aramaic. Myself, through my own studies, I came across a language, an alphabet known as the Hellgate alphabet. When I did my research in this, I dug back pre-Canaanite to the Phoenician, modern-day Beirut. and how this language predates that. It is similar to that. It is similar to the Greek, the Greco, Latin languages. You get into the imagery of death, or the dog, which is Hecate's most sacred animal. Anubis, the headed dog, Lord of the Dead in Egyptian mythology. The only thing that separates Anubis from Bastet is the type of animal. Bastet is the goddess of cats. And what's ironic here about this one is that cats in Egyptian lore are the guardians of the underworld, whereas Anubis is the Lord of the Dead, just like Hades. The stories of the descent going into taverns or caverns, going into caves, digging down into the depths or the bowels, to the gates or the portals into the underworld, just to meet up with a spirit. Association with blood, association with many different attributes and languages can be seen going all the way back to ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Akkadian. So why are so many people led astray by these tones that are associated with the church? Most of these tones were written by Christian ministers. They were written to control the populace, much in the same way as the Wiccan Radi, the threefold law of return. What you put out is what you get in return. So why are they following these? Yesterday, I was in a deep meditative state. I had called upon Azazel. I've been working a lot with Azazel, Belial, Satan. I've been working a lot with Astarte and Beelzebub and Pazuzu and Molech. Okay? These ancient beings. Yesterday, I was just doing an evocation to Azazel. Azaziel. Okay? And I was facing my altar. Literally facing my altar. Sitting in Indian position. The prostration of sitting in Indian position. And by the time it was said and done, after I saw all these images in my mind, when I saw what was being shown to me, when it was done, I looked, and I was at a good 25 degree to my left, staring directly at a talisman hanging on the wall. The Art of Dark Gnosis amulet. The Dark Gnosis amulet. And I thought about this for a little bit afterwards. And I started thinking about it, and I started delving into the works. I started delving into necromancy. I started delving into shamanism. I started delving into blood sorcery, trying to find that link because I knew I had seen some of those images before. And by the time it was said and done, not only did I have over 18 pages of notes taken down, but I had found those images from various different views of the Judeo-Christian society. And that blew my mind. And I started doing research on the authors of these works, these tomes, or what is classified as the sacred tomes. You look at the periods, you look at the times, they were heavily influenced by the church, the Vatican. Prime example is the European Church versus the Vatican. The Knights of Templar were the protectors of the people. And when they worshipped Baphomet. They held on to their pagan views and the Christian views. And when they became too powerful, the Vatican outlawed them. They condemned them. And they slaughtered them and erased the European church. Today, you have so many different denominations of Christians and their little offspring of reversed Hebraic systems. The Church of Satan playing the devil's advocate, playing the bad guy. These dualities of being both a Christian and a witch. A Satanist and a Christian. These are watered down systems. And I was thinking about this, and a couple authors that I know literally have brought this up in their works. On one hand, it's Vokokalakis, Oriax. And on the other hand, you have Alistair Notch, who both questioned the late 80s and early 90s, known as the Satanic Panic. Was this just another witch hunt? Was it just another way to eliminate their enemies? Keeping only those who would literally abide by their ruling? Or was it something to do with the annihilation to regain popularity and dominance? Again, the church is allowed to do whatever the fuck they want without consequences. And people like V.K. Jahannam putting out misinformation, putting out false idealism, false notions, leading people down a dead-end, desolate road. No wonder Satan in Hebrew means opposer. The accuser in Islam. The enemy of God. He who opposes. These are the people that the church wants to rid themselves of, because we put out the truth. We show you the sources, the time errors. We give you references, and we show the lies that the church is showing you, that they're leading you down. And yet people still believe in their stupidity. The world changes, but humanity stays the same. Plain and simple. Look at social media. The duality. No bullying, no harassment. But yet, you got people in the admin, people in the group gangbanging you with bullying, harassment, name calling. And yet, as soon as you stick up for yourself, you're booted from the groups. Interesting. This is why I always say, if you're going to preach on something, always back it up with references, multiple references, and always make yourself available to the public. And the funny thing is, Lilith, you just said they need to meet destruction right in their face. You know what's ironic, though, is when you look before the Dark Ages, around the time of the Dark Ages, the church was literally dying out. The Renaissance was dying. And then witchcraft and everything started coming back. It started coming into full swing. And next thing you know, you have the Dark Ages, the Holy Wars, the Crusades, the Burning Times. And today you got all these freaking idiots sitting there going, no more, not ever again. Plain and simple. And it's hilarious, literally. It is downright fucking hilarious. So when we look at this in a more objective manner, you start doing your own research. You start doing your own studying. You start practicing. You start delving into the arts. You let these beings guide you. not a human standing on an altar, but let these beings guide you. Let them teach you, because they have a much broader view of what you're practicing. I mean, just look at the Bible for an example. It's the biggest hypocrisy of them all. It's full of their own crimes, their own written documentation, their own linguistics, which is mostly rape, murder, warfare, conquering, criminal activities against human rights, enslavement, even incest. And yet nobody says a fucking thing. And yet people forget that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, everything was spoken. It was verbally communicated. It wasn't until 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that books actually started getting written. Before that, it was all scrolls. Look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically the scroll of Amram. The sons of light versus the sons of darkness. Michael versus Belial. Interesting, isn't it? But those are the three topics that I wanted to discuss today. So have a good one. Hope it's been enlightening. And do your own freaking homework and not take things at face value. Because you'll be led down a watered down system that has been corrupted, and that's your own stupidity if you allow it to happen. All right? Have a good one. This Dark Sorcerer is out.